Salam sejahtera and a good day. In this session, we shall be talking about design and analysis of questionnaire-based survey research. The critical stages in questionnaire-based surveys are, first, ideas and conceptualization stage. This is actually similar to any other research that we have covered so far. Then again, similar to what we have done, we should also identify a research problem and their relevant respondent groups. For example, asking a farmer about average daily egg production of his broiler chickens will be very much our place. Then we should also identify and characterize all variables relevant to research problems because this will actually allow us to visualize the relationship between the parameters that we are collecting and what we are trying to test or prove. Formulation or research hypothesis is actually important because this will actually allow us to see whether our theory can actually be translated into outcome. And next, of course, is actually determination of the appropriate research design, viable sample size, and probable error margins. This is again important because it relates to the reliability and the robustness of a study. Another key different steps for the questionnaire-based survey research will be drafting and testing a pre-test questionnaire. Different from other test methods, questionnaire requires pre-testing because pre-testing will actually allow us to see whether the questions can be deployed with minimal problems or without any problems in the field or not. In this case, pre-testing allow us to check for initial reliability, and of course, if times and resources permits, it is actually something that we should be doing. You can actually include some of the subjects from the pre-testing questionnaire to the main study later, provided that we really control the match and control the criteria. Once you have all things in place, it will be the time for you to administer the actual questionnaire-based survey. And once you've got the questionnaires and the response back, it will be the time to code, enter the data, and perform data cleaning. Data cleaning, as I've already mentioned very much earlier, is something that is important because it will make or break your study. So data analysis will follow after you have already cleaned your data, and it doesn't stop here. Once you have gotten your results and interpret the results, it becomes important for you to estimate or determine the reliability of the survey questionnaires. And these are all part and parcel of the report that you should include in your questionnaire survey. So survey research actually meant to quantify variables in a population by asking correct questions to the respondents to minimize bias and to arrive at the correct conclusions about respondent population by examining relationships between these variables. So in order to do that, we have a series of tools. We can actually conduct it in terms of cross-sectional studies, which is common, or longitudinal studies, which is actually much more costly and very susceptible to poor response rate. Remember, in questionnaire-based survey research, the key hurdle will be the respondents' response rate. If you get poor response rate, then you may have issues rationalizing or analyzing your results itself. Now, cross-sectional studies, well, even though it's commonly practiced, it may be difficult to determine the magnitude and direction of causal relationship. And this can be actually mitigated by adding retrospective or past behavior data, or maybe prospective future propensity data in order to counteract that particular cross-sectional study. However, by adding retrospective or prospective data, we are effectively converting these cross-sectional studies into a longitudinal study. Now, longitudinal study is essentially asking the same questions at 2 or more points of time. It can be subdivided into trend study, cohort study, or panel study. So what would be trend, cohort, and panel? This is actually easily indicated as by this particular diagram here. So you can see trend, cohort, and panel study could be surveying different segments of the population. So for trend study, it actually looks at how concepts of perception change over time, whereas cohort study actually look at how exposure factor or historical events affect response over time, whereas panel study, which is actually where you use a fixed panel to see how responses from respondents change over time. So these three types of studies have their own purposes. So in this case, you can see an example of trend study will be, for example, looking at the usage of animal fur as for fashion icons. We know that at the turn of the last century, animal fur is actually something that is required for fashion. However, towards the end of the last century and even now, using animal fur is actually for fashion is actually something of a taboo. And this is actually a very good example of trend study. Whereas for cohort study, you can actually looking at it, you want to see how the trend evolve within a specific population. In this case, actually what you are trying to do is you can use an example of again animal fur versus fashion icon, but now comparing the response between vet students versus fashion designer. You have to understand that fashion designers look at animal fur just like another material, whereas vet students, having known the animal fur industries and all the atrocities related, all the cruelty and welfare issues related, they may have very, very different view as compared to the fashion designers. So in this case, we are adding an additional perspective by segregating or differentiating our respondents to allow us a better insight into the same issue. Panel study, to some extent, you are using the same individual within the population, and then you just keep on testing them, keep on testing them to see whether the trends, whether the response will actually change over time or not. So this diagram briefly tells us that in trend study, you are using a randomized subgroup of the target population, whereas in cohort study, you're using more or less like a defined subgroup, a fixed subgroup with common attributes, whereas in panel study, you are essentially using the same person over and over and over again to see how responses changes over time. And in order for sampling, typically you can have probabilistic or non-probabilistic. For me, it's actually something non-probabilistic actually means that you are actually doing not doing any sampling at all because you everything is based on convenience. Of course, the best approach will be probabilistic sampling to minimize bias. So determination of sample size for survey can be done using this particular formula, whereas n equals proportion that answers yes, multiplied by proportion that answers no, divided by standard error. So in this case, if you have only two responses or maybe something that is more than two responses, you can always structure as half of the population will answer 50%, the other population will answer the other 50%, 0.5 and 0.5. So in this case, if let's say you have six choices, four choices or six choices, you can divide into maybe three of them as proportion answering yes, three of them as proportion answering no, and so on and so forth. So that will actually allow you to calculate the sample size of your respondents required for your survey. Standard error is actually calculated as per the standard error formula indicated in the box there. So based on that particular calculation of ours, at 95% confidence level, at plus minus 5% accuracy, the total number of sample size that we require will be 384. At 99% confidence level, with 5% accuracy, the total sample size required will be 666. So therefore, in order to correct for the formula or the individuals in survey population, because sometimes you only have a finite number of population. Just imagine, I'm asking you to sample the total number of to sample opinion among veterinary students, okay, veterinary students of UPM. So in this case, since the veterinary students in UPM are only limited to maybe about 530 to 550 students, obviously, if let's say you calculated a sample size value of 666, it will be impossible to fulfill no matter how you do it. So in this case, it becomes important for you to adapt this particular formula to have some sort like a finite number of population. So this particular formula here will actually allow us to adapt and adopt the sampling theory based on the number of available individuals. So further on questionnaire design, these 22 or 23 points are actually something that is important for the questionnaire design. This will actually make or break a study. These points about questionnaire design were originally advocated by the SPSS training material, teaching material. So the key points about questionnaire design is number one, you should ask a non-threatening or non-offending questions because non-threatening and non-offending questions often evokes honest response. And of course, ask for answer only on one dimension. That means only request one answer at a time. Do not include or imply that there are two answers, because the respondent may not know which one they are answering for. For example, do you think the quality of veterinary services in Malaysia can be improved by having more vets? So you are actually relating the quality of veterinary services and by having more vets. So in this case, it is actually a one-dimension question, because you are trying to look at the relationship between quality of services and having more vets. But if you add another dimension after the having more vets, then if the respondent answer yes, you will not even know whether they're answering yes to the vets or maybe an additional criteria they were just added. Thirdly, able to accommodate all answers. This is actually why you need to do pre-testing. Fourthly, has mutually exclusive options. So that means all answers are mutually exclusive. This is important if, let's say, you're implying time. Okay, so in this case, you, for example, you want to categorize puppy will be less than 6 months old, 6 to 12, more than 12 months old. But if you do something like less than 6 months old, more than 6 months old, less than 12 months old, will be something that is very confusing, because if you say less than 12 months old, it will also have included those that are below 6 months old. And number 5, produces variability in response. This is actually something that is important, because you are requesting for review, you are requesting for response from your respondent, and therefore you need them to provide clear answer. So you will not be helping your survey by providing answers that do not have variability among them, by looking at the examples I've just cited on this text. And then sixthly, you need to have good flow from a previous section or previous questions to the next section. Number 7, do not imply a desired answer. Now, questionnaire can be easily be manipulated so that you can gear that your respondent will always answer a specific answer. And for example, do you prefer cheaper and value for money products? It is obvious that the answer, of course, will be yes. It is actually a given that people will answer yes. Number 8, do not use emotionally loaded words or ill-defined terms. So, for example, do you think our current boss is actually doing a good job? So, of course, nobody is going to criticize his or her own current boss unless they are willing to resign, and so on and so forth, because these are all emotionally loaded words or ill-defined terms that will complicate your study. Number 9, not dependent on responses from previous questions, minimize or avoid branching. Of course, it is not entirely but either. Sometimes this may be required, but it should be used judiciously so that not to confuse the respondents. Number 10, avoid jargons or double meaning words, and always be sensitive to respondents' cultural and value background. Certain words that may mean well to us may not have not so good meaning in other cultures. Number 11, use open-ended questions only when it is absolutely necessary. And number 12, don't know should be a response, but there should not be too many don't knows. And this is actually why you also need to include some of those questions for pre-testing. If you gather an answer comprising of mostly don't knows, better don't do the study. Number 13, put demographic information or potentially threatening or sensitive questions at the end of the survey, particularly those pertaining to income. 14, of course, it's good for us to create professional, attractive, uncluttered, and official-looking questionnaires, which will actually invite response. Number 15, create and simple questionnaires. Number 16, you should always practice judicious use of Likert scale. And whatever that you do not include too many scale points. 7 points should be maximum. And you use even numbered scales when you are trying to force respondents to choose, and use odd-numbered scales if you intend to offer a middle choice, for example, like no opinion and so on and so forth. But bear in mind, if you allow the respondents to have a neutral opinion, it may not help you in your survey if you get a lot of neutral responses. And of course, bear in mind that if you have a scale of 1 to 5, respondents often shun extremes. So sometimes you may use a 7 point Likert scale in order to invite a much more obvious response. This is actually a common trait noticed by researchers among respondents, because nobody will typically answer the extreme choice of, let's say, 1 or 7. Technically, we are actually subconsciously geared to answer questions that are not really outstanding. Number 17, please provide clear instructions on how to answer the questionnaires. Number 18, questionnaires that facilitate data collection or interviews should be encouraged. Try not to design questionnaires that are very lengthy. If possible, try to fit all your questionnaires within the same page, but making it legible either as well. And insert intentional questionnaire to cross-check or verify consistency of response if necessary. Okay, and this is actually something that you can see here. So how you can, the example will be, how often do you feed your pet a day? And then next question will be, who feeds your pet most of the time and how many times a day? So in this case, you can see that question 2B and 2A is actually being used to check for responses in Roman 1. But of course, you cannot have too many cross-check or verify questions in your questionnaire, because it will make your entire questionnaire very, very lengthy. But do include them strategically to verify crucial or important parameters in your survey. Number 20, we should also be mindful that when you are deploying questionnaire over the phone or for face-to-face, then you have serial position effects. You're going to encounter serial position effects. Serial position effects are actually going to affect how respondents make their choice or respond to your questionnaire. This is actually related to how information is processed and retrieved, and which may result in unwanted bias. So you can have recency effects whereby only the last few items are recalled better or chosen, or primacy effects whereby only the first few items are recalled better or chosen. Recall your experience of going to a restaurant without menu. You may only recall items that are familiar to you. It could be the last few items that the waiter have already mentioned to you, or maybe the first few items that he mentioned to you, or maybe items that you are familiar with. So without menu to refer to, you have to rely on memory. So try to relate this experience to your respondents while responding to your questionnaire. And number 21, recall that in panel survey, we are actually using the same questionnaires on the same panel over time and over time. So what will be the limit? What will be the minimum time for us to actually, minimum time gap for us to actually repeat the same questionnaire again? You can see, look at this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. This is actually something that estimates the retention of facts in our mind. So this was actually first proposed by Ebbinghaus in the late 19th century. So you can see here, we may only retain 58% or whatever they were learned 20 minutes after we have been told. However, beyond 6 days and up to a month, we can only retain about a quarter. So that means best to repeat questionnaire when the retention rate falls below 25% or about 2 weeks after initial exposure. This is actually to ensure that the respondents are not able to predict what we're going to ask next. Now, you also have to recall the uniqueness of questionnaire-based survey is that every time when a respondent answer your questions, they are trying to project their personal image to you. So they could be manufacturing that image subconsciously or consciously while answering your questions. So if you give them questionnaires that they are familiar with, it will be it will provide them with even better chances of modifying the response to suit what they want or what you actually wanted in the study. So in this case, you may even, in order to minimize this effect, you may want to use experiment design that cater for pre-exposure effects. For example, the Solomon 4 group that we already discussed very much earlier in this lecture series. Now, another important part about questionnaire survey design is actually we can also use an index or a matrix to check for the reliability of questionnaires. Now, this is actually a very crucial part because regardless, we want our questionnaires to be neutral, something like what you expect of a weighing scale. So a weighing scale will actually give you accurate weight, provided it's been calibrated properly. It doesn't care whether you're rich, you're famous, non-famous, you are a student, a lecturer, or any other person. So it will just report your true weight. So you wanted your questionnaire to be that way as well. So this is actually where we talk about reliability. In this case, one measure of reliability is known as Cronbach's alpha. Cronbach's alpha will actually allow us to make sure that our questionnaire will consistently give us consistent response regardless of which population that we tried them on. Remember that questionnaires that has been validified with high reliability are known as instruments, and typically instruments can be copyrighted and sell for lots of money. So Cronbach's alpha ranges from 0, meaning no internal consistency, to 1, perfect internal consistency, meaning that the questionnaire or instruments will always give you predictable response. And questionnaire must have at least 0.7, which is acceptable internal consistency in terms of Cronbach's alpha to be deemed reliable enough. Anything less than 0.6 is considered poor or unacceptable. So if you encounter questionnaires whereby the Cronbach's alpha is less than 0.6, it means that you may need to add more items in order to improve its reliability. And alpha value or Cronbach's alpha value of anything more than 0.8 or 0.9 is considered excellent. So the alpha value can be calculated for a construct or idea that can be explained by a set of items or questions or multiple constructs as exemplified in the next slide. So here we'll be using the example to determine the benefits, anxiety, willingness to learn VPP 3160 statistics among DVM4 students. So these are the questions given. So each of these benefits, anxiety, and willingness is actually a construct. Each construct is actually comprised of multiple parameters. So by answering these parameters, we know how we will know the characteristics of this construct for that particular population. So there's also another important thing that I need to inform everyone. In this case, do note that the benefits are asked in all positive tones. The anxiety questionnaires are asked in negative tones, whereas the willingness are actually asked in mixed tone. So this all will have consequences to your findings and whether the questions will be reliable or not. And note that I'm using a 5-point Likert scale divided between disagree and agree. So in this case, I am actually forcing the respondent to make a choice. So based on that, we use 10 student respondents. So this will be the response tabulated following that particular survey for the 9 categories, that 9 questionnaires that already 9 questions that already asked just now. So to perform the reliability analysis, we have to go to analyze a scale reliability analysis. So we need to include all 9 questions and examine the results. Then look at the internal consistency. Repeat step 2, but this time segregate into their individual constructs, namely benefits, anxiety, and willingness. Then it is important for us to consider or look at the alpha values. And we also have to explain why the alpha values are different and what does it mean in this case. And remember the mixed tone questions from willingness. If you remove certain elements from the analysis, what will change? So let's go to the results. First and foremost, we need to include all 9 questions. So all 9 questions will give you a Cronbach's alpha of 0.714. So this is actually something that is good, telling us that our questionnaires has good reliability. And again, you can also see what happened if, let's say, a particular question is actually eliminated from this particular set of questionnaire. So you see, if let's say you eliminate benefit 1, the Cronbach's alpha will be 0.675. It means that question benefit 1 contribute to the Cronbach's alpha, because recall that if you include all 9 questions, the Cronbach's alpha will be 0.714. But if you eliminate B1, then it will be 0.675. So we can go further down, and then we notice that one particular number, one particular question, which is question willingness 2. If you eliminate it, the Cronbach's alpha can actually increase. So that means what? That means question willingness 2 actually may need to be excluded in order to improve the reliability of the questionnaire. So it means we need to investigate further what is actually going on here. Recall that we need to segregate further into 3 constructs, namely benefits, willingness, and few other parameters in this case. So first, let's look at benefits. When you analyze as benefits alone, the Cronbach's alpha will be 0.907. This is obviously higher than the combined Cronbach's alpha of 0.714. So obviously, it means the benefits are, to some extent, has some degree of crisscross between positive and negative tone. Recall that benefits are actually constructed in positive tone versus another parameter that is actually negative tone and willingness that is actually in mixed tone. So obviously, this affects Cronbach's alpha. This directly tells you that you should practice either positive tone questionnaire or negative tone questionnaire and not supposed to mix them. So in this case, the same manner as well, it would also tell you if you eliminate any one of the questionnaire, what would it contribute to the Chromebox alpha? So in this case, you can see that by eliminating B3, you can actually improve the Chromebox alpha. Next will be anxiety. Similar to the benefits, if you analyze it on its own as an own construct, then the Chromebox alpha will be 0.946, much higher than 0.714. And then again, you also see similar trends. If you eliminate A2 and A3, obviously it will be higher than the 0.946 included when all these three A1, A2, A3 questions are included, telling us that we need to investigate further. Next will be a willingness. You can see that willingness gave us a Chromebox alpha that is actually negative. Negative actually just imply that response is happening on the opposite. But for Chromebox alpha, we can also take into account negative values, even though it's discouraged. So in this case, it tells us that it is actually messing up with our reliability of this particular construct, which is willingness. Remember, the willingness was constructed in both mixed tone. That means a positive tone and a negative tone. So in this case, so this is actually what you can see here. If you eliminate W1, the Chromebox alpha will minus 0.982. If you eliminate W2, then it will be 0.677. So obviously, there are some degree of inconsistencies that you need to do here. And that's why the instruction was to eliminate W2. So it is clear that if you eliminate, it is clear from the results that there are three embedded constructs in this questionnaire, which is namely benefits, anxiety, and willingness, and each of them behaving differently. And since the Chromebox alpha differed very much from the 0.714 when all 9 questions are included, then they are best analyzed separately. So in this case, it also highlighted to you the importance of consistency in directional coding. Remember, benefits are coded in positive tone, anxiety in negative tone, whereas willingness in a mixed tone. So it means that you should either use all positive tone or all negative tone and never mix. Inconsistent item then should be identified, maybe remodel or maybe rephrase, or maybe new elements are actually added. So in this case, you may want to do that in order to ensure that your questionnaires will always have high internal consistency or high Chromebox alpha. So this Chromebox alpha actually provide you with that necessary justification to include certain parameters in your composite score. So looking at that particular alpha value, what you can actually do. So it's obvious that there are certain elements that you need to remove. So you can have this one of these particular 3 choices. Number 1, disregard the items and formulate new items. That's one choice. Secondly, improve the questionnaire by checking the dimensionality of data and regrouping the relevant items. Remember that you can only ask one dimension in terms of question. And of course, keep on adding items until Chromebox alpha is satisfactory, which is also another approach. But of course, on top of that, we can also use the PCA under factor analysis to further investigate the data. Bear in mind that the PCA is actually not within the syllabus of this course, and therefore I shall not be talking about the PCA analysis. So in this case, it's obvious that you may need to eliminate W2 in this case. So and focus on W or reframe the questions in W2 so that you can achieve higher levels of higher reliability as indicated by the Chromebox alpha. Now, having said that, this brings us to the weakness of survey research. Surveys may be a cost-effective type of research compared to controlled clinical trial, etc. But the greatest weakness is probably due to the fact that all surveys are basically exploratory. So there are no ways for you to pinpoint a causal relationship between factors using survey because you are actually getting opinions from your respondents. Therefore, there's actually a limited ability in concluding a cause and effect relationship among variables. Other weaknesses in the survey research will include, number 1, bias reactivity. Respondents tend to give socially desirable responses that make them look good or seem to be what the researcher is looking for. So this is actually a bias that you need to be mindful when you are actually administering questionnaires. You will get different responses when you are administrating the questionnaires on your own to the respondents versus the respondents completing the questionnaires in your absence. Number 2, challenging sample frame. Bear in mind that on average, only 1 out of 7 or maybe 1 out of 10 of the questionnaires that you send out will be will come back to you. So you may have very big issues in terms of compliance or response rate. And in this case, it may be difficult to access the proper number and type of respondents who are needed for the representative sample of a target population. And this may happen all around you. I'm very sure you may have been given survey, and how many of us actually responded to all the surveys on time. Okay, and this brings us to the third one, which is risk of non-response. And this may range from refuse to participate, non-cooperation, or simply drop out of survey if you are performing a serious survey. And finally, measurement error. Surveys are often full of systemic biases during sampling, during question framing, and of course, loaded questions. Loaded questions are questions with probable answers that might discourage respondents from being honest. So in this case, it is important for you not to include those type of questionnaires, as it will severely impact the ability of the questionnaires at discovering a finding. So in this case, it's something that everybody should be mindful that survey research, while cheap, it has inherent weaknesses. So it should be used judiciously for us to more or less like understand the target audience that we are actually surveying and identifying as a preliminary study to identify key factors that contributed for further studies further down the road.